Yeah. So as you state in the book, I mean, your breakfast consisted of a raw egg and cod liver oil, and no bathroom after 7:30 at night after your bedtime, which forced you to urinate in the closet and on the wall because they wouldn't let you use the restroom, and the disciplinary measures were pretty harsh.
Yeah, they beat us frequently with the belt. They didn't feed us all the time. We were very thin. We didn't bathe. We were never taken to a doctor. We weren't allowed to have friends. And we did all their housework and all the housework for their cousins who lived around the corner. And so that was difficult. And we were constantly being punished. One of the responsibilities we had was to babysit their son, who was 3 years old. And as a 3-year-old, it's not uncommon to be bratty, but we had to do whatever that kid told us to do. And if he got upset, we could get in trouble and be punished, which means either getting beat or one of the punishments was to stand up against the wall late at night in their master bedroom, just in our underwear, with our hands out to the side and our legs spread, sort of like a jumping jack position. So my brother Dennis and I used to do that while they watched television. So it was very painful punishment, and we used to listen to the Johnny Carson show, listen to people laugh, and they'd watch Laugh-In, and we'd listen to that. And I wrote in the book that when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon and said, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," I was actually looking at the wall when I heard that. So that's the sort of life that we had there.
And so you decide one day that you've had enough of this.
Right.
And you decide that you're going to take off. And the way you're going to do it is you're going to get up in the morning and you're going to quietly leave because you don't want to wake the Wassers, and you don't want to stir the dog. Mm-hmm. The dog starts barking, and then you're found out. But so you head out the door, but you decide that you're not going to take Dennis. You're going to go this alone. You're going to leave him sleeping, and you're going to head out the door. And when you do, you realize that you're in your pajamas and your slippers, but you keep going anyhow. Why leave Dennis behind? It seems like, you guys you weren't fed together, you were beaten together, you weren't bathed together. It was like, and while you're realizing and finding it uncomforting that the rest of your siblings and family are separated and you don't know when you're going to see them again, Dennis is left behind.
Sure. Definitely not an easy decision. So I had just turned 11 2 weeks earlier, and I didn't plan on running away. I just woke up in the middle of the night. And when I did, I said I could just run away right now if I wanted to. And I thought, well, let me wake Dennis up. But Dennis was so brutalized by these people.
More so than you.
Yes, for some reason. And I was afraid that if I woke him up, he wouldn't be able to handle what I was going to ask him to do, and he may have made some noise. So I made a decision right there that let me just try to get out of here, and then I'll get help.
So you head out, and again you realize I've got my pajamas on, I've got my slippers on, and the sun is starting to come up, and you're in the book you say you're watching as cars are coming down the road because the Wassers could be right on your tail here. But a car comes and stops and picks you up, and it's a gentleman, and you get in the car and he asks you where you're going, and you say, well, I'm going to the deli to get breakfast for my family, and he kind of gives you the look that, okay, all right, Sonny, what's really going on here? And it ends up being a police officer. I would imagine you're 11. Panic probably sets in at that point. What goes through your mind?
Well, I had no recourse. I was sort of at the mercy of this person when I got in his van. And again, I'm only 11. I'm actually weigh about 60 pounds at the time. So I just kept my hand by the handle to jump out if I needed to. And I tried to explain to him, but he had a walkie-talkie in the van. He was a young man, and he asked me where I was going. I told him, and he didn't buy my story. And he noticed me looking out the window, sort of scared. And he said, "Okay, what's going on, little guy?" And I told him, and he said, "Well, I'm a police officer." So that was the break I always needed.
And so you asked to go back to Little Flower, and so he decides he's going to take you back, and he goes back and he reaches out to Father Fagan to explain the situation. And what happens then?
Well, Father Fagan said, "Look, we have no beds open for you, Kevin, and or your brother Dennis, and I'm sorry to hear what had happened to you. So what I'm going to do is give these foster parents a call today and tell them to stop this, and we'll send you back there, and as soon as we get a bed, we'll bring you back here." And I said, "No, there is no way. If you send me back, I will be back here tomorrow. I will run away again." I said, there's just no way. I was so adamant that he realized, okay, I have to deal with this kid today. So I suggested, I had met some people from Ireland on one of these days, visiting Sundays when my parents used to visit me, and they seemed really nice. Why don't you ask them? And he said, "I just can't ask people to take people in." I said, "Ask. I know they'll take me. Ask them." So he did, and they said they would take me. So I left that office with Father Fagan that day, and wound up living with the Irish people who were the Healys.
And so you have to obviously not only ask for yourself, but Dennis is still back at the Wasser house. Does that police officer go back and get Dennis, or does Father Fagan go back, or do they bring Dennis back to Little Flower? How do you guys reunite?
Well, believe it or not, it took about a week for Dennis to get taken out of that home. And during that time, he was beaten very badly by them because they felt that he knew I was going to run away, which he didn't. And that he hid it from them. And so they took it out on him. But the Healy family, the Irish people, agreed to take Dennis in as well, and with the thought that they would hold us until Little Flower found a bed for us.
And so what was life like with the Healys? You're there, you met them in the past. How did things start to change then for you?
Well, it was very new for me. I mean, I remember just sleeping in the bed and feeling, wow, these sheets are clean. Like, this is great. And they had a wool blanket, and I was able to take a bath there, and they got all the dirt off me. I had a tremendous amount of dirt on my body. It was caked on. And so those simple things were just, incredible for me to experience. And plus they were nice and friendly, and I was allowed to play on the street, and they were loving people. And so all of that was all new for me. And they didn't drink, Mr. Healy smoked cigarettes.
But as you're back at the Wasser place, you say you know when you got to the Healy's, you were able to bathe, and there was so much dirt caked on you from over time. I mean, were you not going to school? Did the Wassers not send you to school? Did anybody not say, "Boy, this child is in really bad shape. We've got to look at what's going on here at this house"?
So I have a couple of chapters directed to filth that I lived in and how filthy I was. It was difficult. I did go to school. Kids picked up on it, and nobody did anything about it.
No teachers, no principals,
No,
nobody pulling you aside and saying, "Kevin, what's going on here?"
no. And I talk about getting my physical at school, and the only thing the doctor said to me was cough.
Yeah, and obviously, since Wasser's prohibited you from having friends, you weren't playing over somebody else's house so that other families could see what was going on. It was pretty well covered up.
Right. I did have one day when I snuck out to play with a boy named David. It's not in the book, but it was in the original notes. I had a chapter on it. And he invited me into his house. He lived across the street, and his father, they were the Gold family, David Gold, and father was a boxing fan, and we sat down and watched boxing on TV. It's like Wide World of Sports or something. Eating potato chips and drinking soda. And then when the fight was over, so I still remember the fight. It was Nino Beninbeauty or something, some Italian middleweight boxer against Floyd Patterson or something. In any case, I left the house, and the Wassers saw me leaving the house. Where were you? What's going on? And I just really in a lot of trouble for that. But that was the closest I came to having a friend. And I was at the Wassers for 2 years.
2 years. So at the Healy's, you're getting ingrained, and then Dennis comes to join you at the Healy's. Is that right?
Yes.
And then one day, Margaret and Tom Healy sit you down and they tell you that you're going to be leaving them to reunite with your mother, and she happens to be at this point in upstate New York. How old were you at this time? Were you still 11, 12? What was your age?
No, I was 13 and a half, almost 14.
So you're at the Wassers for several years. Your mother makes the move, and then I'm assuming she must reach out to somebody, and Healy's rather tell you that you're going to be reunited.
Right. So I was at the Wassers for 2 years, and then the Healy's for about 2.5 years.
Yeah.
So periodically we would be brought before the family court to be assessed by the system, if you will. And on one of those times, the judge asked me, and I remember looking up at the judge, he asked me, Kevin, if you could go back to live with your parents, would you want to live with your mother or your father? Because they were not together. But before he asked me that question, he asked me, Kevin, have you ever felt afraid with either of your parents? Afraid for your safety or just afraid in general? And I didn't know what to say. The question came out of nowhere. And I just described a time when my father came to visit us and took us fishing, Dennis and I, out in the bay. And we entered some very shallow water. And he said, why don't you kids jump out, feel what it's like out in the bay? So we did. But then the boat started drifting away. And I was worried that my father was going to leave us out there. I said that to the judge. And he inferred a lot from that moment and said, okay, thank you, Kevin. So the courts decided I should go live with my mother. And she had met another man, and they had bought or rented a house in upstate New York, out in the country. And we left the Healy home on Long Island and went to live up there, Dennis and I.
And you get up to upstate New York, and it's a whole new environment up there. And you're a little bit of a rabble-rouser when you get up there. Maybe doing some things you shouldn't be. And you eventually make it back to the Healys, is that right?
Yes, I went up there. Again, I was 13 and a half, and I get to see my brother Mickey again, my brother Pat, and the rest of my siblings and my mother. But what disturbed me the most in being there was that they were drinking all the time. They were drunk. People were throwing up. And I went to talk with my brother Pat, whom I looked up to a great deal. But he was drunk or stoned on things, and he was 15, 16 years old. So Mickey and I had difficulty living at my mother's place up there, and we decided to run away from there just after a few months and go.
You and Mickey?
Yes. Go back down to New York City and live with my father.
And Dennis is still upstate?
Yes.
And so you get there, and your mother's behavior hasn't changed, and she's remarried, or she's living with another gentleman.
Remarried, yeah.
Remarried.
Well, married for the first time.
Okay, yep, married. And that alcoholic behavior is going on, and at the same time, your brother is experimenting with alcohol and drugs.
Yes, my siblings were.
Yeah.
Mickey and I didn't want that. And I had also noticed that my brother Mickey was having some issues with mental health at the time. It was my first peek into that, or knowledge of it. So we moved down to live with my father in the city. But when we got there, we just hung out in the bars while we played pool and watched TV. My father drank at the bar. And I got to see how he spent a lot of money there. And I used to watch the money on the bar. And Mickey and I started ninth grade there, and Mickey started 10th in the city. And after just several days of going to school, we stopped going. So we weren't even going to school anymore. And we would just walk around the city and get into trouble.
Stealing bikes.
At that point, we weren't stealing bikes. My brother was experimenting with burglary, and we would go around and solicit money from people, pretending we were raising money for various causes, and with a coffee can. It was just really, crude, and we were just up to no good. We weren't going to school. We weren't drinking or doing anything at that time, but we were pretty much isolated.
Are you in touch with the Healys throughout this?
No. And what happened was my brother and I got into a fight in my father's apartment, and my brother lost it. And he was a year older than me, Mickey, and he tried to strangle me. And for some reason he stopped, but he had control of me. He had his hands around my neck and was strangling me. And the window was open, and we heard some Spanish ladies outside arguing or yelling out of nowhere. And it was enough to disrupt his train of thought, and he stopped strangling me. And I immediately got up and ran out of the house and just hitchhiked back to the Healys and asked them to take me back.
So do you go back by yourself? Does Dennis reunite with you? Does Mickey come along to the Healys?
No, it was just me for a while, and then Dennis had already been bounced from my mother's house and put into another foster home, and he found his way back to the Healys. Now, at this time with the Healys, we were introduced to drugs in the neighborhood. The neighborhood had changed, and we started doing all sorts of drugs and drinking alcohol and not going to school, and we were just really public enemy number one in that neighborhood.
Even though you saw this behavior going on with your mother and your father, and you go back to your father, and you take a drink and you start experimenting with drugs, and
yeah, and I don't want to blame that on anyone other than me, but when I went back to Brentwood, the friends that I had in my prior
Healy's.
trip, to the Healy's, they were all doing drugs and drinking, and I was just,
seemed like the thing to do.
I just rolled right in on it, and it became sort of my identity. I didn't really have much self-esteem or identity or how I was going to fit in, so I gravitated towards being the punk of the neighborhood. And so again, not going to school, taking all sorts of drugs, and drinking all the time, and doing a lot of vandalism in the neighborhood.